The moment a courtroom goes silent, someone's life is about to change. The old bailiff used to say, and on that cold Thursday morning in Richmond, Virginia, every person inside courtroom 4A was about to learn exactly how true those words were. The room had been full only seconds earlier with the ordinary sounds of justice moving forward, papers sliding across polished wooden desks, attorneys whispering final notes to their clients, the distant hum of the heating system fighting the December chill outside, and the faint scratching of pens against legal pads. Sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking the city, casting long golden reflections across the dark hardwood floor. Nearly 70 people sat inside the gallery, waiting for the next hearing to begin. Nobody expected anything unusual. Nobody expected history. At the front of the room sat a middle-aged black woman wearing a simple black judicial robe. Her posture was straight. Her expression calm. Her hands rested quietly on the bench in front of her. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance, nothing that demanded attention. In fact, if someone had walked into the courtroom without context, they might have mistaken her for the most ordinary person in the room. Yet there was something unusual in the way she carried herself. A steadiness. A quiet confidence that seemed completely untouched by the pressure surrounding her. The digital clock on the wall displayed 10:17 a.m. The next case was scheduled to begin in less than 3 minutes. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. The sound echoed sharply against the walls. Conversation stopped instantly. Every head turned. 2 uniformed police officers entered with quick, deliberate steps. Their heavy boots struck the floor with enough force to command attention before either man spoke a single word. The taller officer, Ryan Walker, moved first. His face carried the unmistakable expression of someone who believed he was in complete control of the room. His jaw was tight. His shoulders squared. His eyes swept across the courtroom as if everyone present existed merely to witness what was about to happen. Behind him followed Officer Derek Collins, equally serious, equally determined. A ripple of confusion spread through the gallery. Attorneys exchanged uncertain looks. A court reporter paused her typing. Even the bailiff standing near the front appeared caught off guard. Officer Walker never slowed down. He walked directly toward the bench. Directly toward the black woman seated at the front of the courtroom. The silence deepened with every step. 20 feet. 15 feet. 10. Nobody understood what was happening. The woman remained seated. Calm. Motionless. Watching. Then Walker stopped and pointed straight at her. "Stand up," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Several people gasped. The words seemed impossible in that setting. The woman did not immediately respond. She simply looked at him with an expression that revealed nothing. No fear. No anger. No panic. Just quiet observation. Walker took another step forward. "Did you hear me?" he demanded. "Stand up." The room felt colder somehow. The air heavier. Every person present sensed that something was terribly wrong, yet nobody could explain why. Phones slowly appeared beneath desks and inside jacket pockets as people began recording. A young law clerk near the front row swallowed hard and stared at the woman as if trying desperately to understand something everyone else had missed. But the woman still said nothing. She simply rose slowly to her feet, smoothing one sleeve of her robe with calm, deliberate movements. And in that moment, while confusion spread through the courtroom like wildfire, one question silently settled into every mind present. Why did the woman being publicly humiliated appear to be the only person in the room who wasn't worried? The strange thing was not that Officer Ryan Walker had ordered her to stand. The strange thing was that she had obeyed without the slightest hesitation. Most people in that situation would have demanded answers. Some would have argued. Others would have looked around for support. The woman simply rose to her feet as though she had expected the interruption long before anyone else in the room realized it was coming. The silence inside courtroom 4A became almost unbearable. Even the heating vents seemed quieter. Ryan studied her face, clearly searching for a reaction he never received. No fear appeared in her eyes. No outrage. No desperation. She looked at him the way someone might look at a storm moving across the horizon, aware of its presence but unconvinced it would last forever. Several rows back, an elderly attorney slowly removed his glasses. He had practiced law for more than 30 years and had witnessed nearly every kind of courtroom conflict imaginable. Yet something about this moment unsettled him. It was not the officers. It was not the accusation. It was the woman herself. Her calm felt wrong for someone supposedly facing public humiliation. Ryan seemed to notice it too. His confidence remained intact, but a faint irritation crept into his expression. He was accustomed to controlling situations. He understood anger. He understood panic. He understood resistance. Calmness was harder to manage. Calmness made people ask questions. Around the courtroom, whispers began spreading despite everyone's effort to remain professional. A young associate attorney leaned toward her colleague and quietly asked whether anyone knew what was happening. The colleague only shook his head. Near the jury box, a court clerk stared at the woman with visible concern. Her hands trembled slightly above a stack of case files. She looked as if she wanted to say something but thought better of it. The woman noticed none of it, or perhaps she noticed all of it and chose not to react. Ryan cleared his throat. "You are coming with us," he said. His voice echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Again, she offered no argument. Instead, she slowly glanced across the room. Her eyes moved from face to face. Not searching for help. Not pleading for support. Simply observing. It was a look that lingered in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Some later described it as sadness. Others called it disappointment. One reporter would eventually describe it as the look of someone watching people walk willingly toward a mistake they could still avoid. Outside the courthouse windows, December sunlight reflected off parked cars and patches of old frost. The city moved normally. Traffic lights changed. Pedestrians crossed intersections. A delivery truck rolled past the building carrying holiday decorations. Yet inside the courtroom, time seemed suspended. Every second stretched longer than the one before it. Ryan finally gestured toward the aisle. The woman nodded once and stepped forward. The movement sent another wave of confusion through the gallery. Why was she cooperating so easily? Why did she appear more concerned about everyone else than herself? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did several experienced attorneys suddenly look less worried about the woman being escorted away and more worried about the officers leading her there? No one had the answer yet. But as the woman began walking from the bench, a growing feeling settled over the room. Whatever story people believed they were witnessing was not the real story at all. The walk from the bench to the center aisle could not have been more than 30 feet, yet it felt much longer to everyone watching. Every step seemed to draw more attention. More uncertainty. More questions. The woman moved with measured calm, her black robe swaying slightly as she walked between rows of attorneys and spectators who now stared openly. Nobody returned to their notes. Nobody checked their watches. The entire courtroom had become focused on a single unfolding moment. Officer Ryan Walker appeared to enjoy it. The corners of his mouth lifted ever so slightly each time another person pulled out a phone. He noticed the cameras. He noticed the whispers. Most importantly, he noticed the audience. Some people crave authority. Others crave recognition. Ryan wanted both. As he walked beside the woman, he straightened his shoulders and raised his voice just enough to ensure everyone could hear him. "Keep moving," he said. The command sounded less like procedure and more like performance. His partner, Officer Derek Collins, remained close behind, watching the growing crowd with visible satisfaction. Near the back of the courtroom, a local reporter quietly began recording. News traveled fast in Richmond, especially when something unusual happened inside a courthouse. Within minutes, clips would begin circulating online. Ryan knew that. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. The woman continued forward without protest. Her expression remained unchanged. The same steady composure. The same unsettling calm. It was becoming harder for people to ignore. A prosecutor seated near the front exchanged a nervous glance with the defense attorney. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Both were thinking the same thing. Something was wrong. Not procedurally wrong. Something deeper. Something that did not fit. Ryan stopped briefly near the courtroom doors and turned toward the gallery. The movement felt intentional, almost theatrical. "This investigation is ongoing," he announced. "Everyone will remain seated until instructed otherwise." His voice carried across the room with practiced authority. Yet instead of restoring order, it seemed to deepen the tension. People were no longer focused on his words. They were watching the woman. Watching how she responded. Watching how little she responded. One law student sitting in the second row later described it as the strangest thing she had ever witnessed. She said it felt as though the officers believed they were controlling the situation, while the woman somehow understood something they did not. As the group reached the double doors leading into the courthouse corridor, the woman briefly paused. Not because anyone stopped her. Not because she resisted. Her eyes simply drifted toward a framed photograph hanging on the wall beside the exit. A photograph showing generations of public servants who had worked inside the courthouse over the past century. Her gaze lingered for barely a second before she continued walking. Yet several people noticed. And for reasons they could not explain, that tiny moment unsettled them even more than the confrontation itself. Beyond the doors, the hallway stretched nearly 80 yards beneath bright overhead lights. Court employees moved through the building carrying folders, coffee cups, and legal documents. One by one, conversations stopped as the officers emerged with the woman between them. Heads turned. Faces registered surprise. Then confusion. Then something closer to disbelief. Ryan kept walking, confident and purposeful. Derek followed close behind. But the farther they moved through the courthouse, the more unusual the reactions became. People were not staring at the woman the way one might expect. They were staring at the officers. Some looked shocked. Others looked worried. A few simply froze in place. And still, either officer seemed to notice that the people witnessing their display were beginning to ask a question that had not yet reached them. What if the person being publicly escorted through this building was not the one whose future was about to change forever? The farther they moved down the courthouse corridor, the more the atmosphere changed. At first it was only small things. A receptionist stopped answering her phone mid-sentence. A deputy clerk froze while carrying a stack of folders nearly 6 inches thick. 2 attorneys emerging from an elevator suddenly stepped aside and watched in silence as the group passed. None of those reactions made sense to Ryan Walker. In his mind, the operation was proceeding exactly as planned. He had the attention of the building. He had witnesses. He had authority. What he failed to notice was that the expressions around him were no longer expressions of curiosity. They were expressions of recognition. The woman walked steadily between the 2 officers. Her pace never changed. Her breathing remained even. The polished marble floor reflected the bright courthouse lights above, creating long streaks of white beneath their feet. Somewhere in the distance, a copier hummed. An elevator bell chimed. Ordinary sounds continued all around them, yet the tension seemed to grow with every yard they traveled. Then came the first clue. A young assistant district attorney stepped out of a conference room carrying a legal brief. The moment he saw the woman, the color drained from his face. He stopped so abruptly that several pages slipped from his folder and scattered across the floor. He did not bend to retrieve them. He simply stared. Ryan noticed the reaction and frowned. For a brief second, uncertainty flickered across his features. Then it disappeared. He continued walking. 20 yards later, another clue appeared. A senior court administrator standing near the records office looked directly at the woman and immediately reached for her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed. She turned away from the corridor, speaking in a hurried whisper. Ryan caught only a few words. "They actually did it." The statement meant nothing to him. But several nearby employees heard it and exchanged worried glances. The woman herself remained silent. Her gaze moved calmly across the courthouse she knew so well. Past offices. Past conference rooms. past framed photographs of legal milestones spanning decades. There was a familiarity in the way she looked at everything, as though she had spent years walking those halls. Yet Ryan seemed determined not to notice. His attention remained fixed on maintaining control of the scene. As they approached the central rotunda, something even stranger happened. Conversation stopped entirely. Nearly 30 people occupied the large circular space connecting multiple courthouse wings. Attorneys, clerks, interns, courthouse staff, and visitors. One by one, every voice faded. The room became so quiet that footsteps echoed against the stone walls. Ryan finally seemed aware that something felt different. His confidence remained visible, but it was no longer effortless. He glanced around and found dozens of eyes staring back at him. Not with admiration. Not with approval. With concern. Then an older man near the information desk removed his glasses and spoke softly to nobody in particular. "This is a mistake." The words were barely above a whisper, yet several people heard them. Ryan heard them too. He stopped walking and turned slightly toward the speaker. Before he could respond, another voice emerged from the crowd. Then another. Not accusations. Not protests. Just confused disbelief spreading through the rotunda like ripples across water. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Ryan Walker felt something he had not expected to feel that morning. He felt the faint, uncomfortable sensation that everyone around him knew something he did not. Ryan Walker forced himself to keep moving. Whatever discomfort had begun creeping into his thoughts, he refused to acknowledge it. People questioned police decisions all the time. That was nothing new. What mattered was maintaining authority, maintaining confidence, maintaining the image that he knew exactly what he was doing. Yet the deeper they moved into the courthouse, the harder that became. The central rotunda opened into a broad hallway leading toward administrative offices and secure processing rooms. Normally, employees hurried through the area carrying files and rushing between meetings. Today, movement seemed to slow wherever the woman appeared. People stepped aside. Conversations ended. Eyes followed her. More phones appeared. More recordings began. Somewhere online, clips from the courtroom were already spreading beyond the courthouse walls. Ryan did not know that thousands of people were beginning to watch. He did not know that retired attorneys, former judges, and legal reporters were already sharing the footage with growing disbelief. Inside the building, however, the atmosphere continued to shift. The woman remained silent. Her posture never changed. She neither hurried nor resisted. She simply walked forward with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the courtroom. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Ryan looked increasingly determined to project control. She looked increasingly at peace. Near the end of the hallway, they passed a conference room with glass walls. Inside, nearly a dozen attorneys had been meeting around a long oak table. Every single one of them stood as the group passed. Not one returned to their seat. Not one looked away. Their expressions carried a mixture of concern and disbelief. One woman pressed her hand against the glass as though she had just witnessed something deeply wrong. Derek Collins finally noticed. "Why is everybody staring?" he muttered under his breath. Ryan did not answer. For the first time all morning, he did not seem to have one. They reached a waiting area outside a secured section of the courthouse. Leather chairs lined the walls. Framed state seals hung beneath warm lighting. The woman was directed toward one of the chairs. She sat down calmly and folded her hands in her lap. The room fell. Quiet again. A clock ticked softly somewhere overhead. Ryan remained standing. He checked his phone. Several missed calls had appeared. Then several more. Then a new message. He glanced at the screen and immediately locked it again. Something about the message disturbed him. Derek noticed. "Everything okay?" Ryan nodded too quickly. "Fine." But his voice lacked its earlier certainty. More courthouse staff began gathering beyond the glass doors. Not enough to create a scene. Just enough to watch. A clerk whispered something to a deputy. The deputy immediately turned pale. Another employee hurried away carrying a phone pressed tightly against her ear. Information was moving now. Fast. Faster than Ryan realized. The woman finally lifted her eyes and looked through the glass at the growing crowd. There was sadness there. Not for herself. For them. For everyone rushing toward a consequence they still could not see. Ryan followed her gaze and saw the gathering faces. The questions. The concern. The disbelief. And for the first time that day, an uncomfortable possibility entered his mind. What if this was no longer about an investigation? What if the entire courthouse was watching because they already understood something he had completely missed? The waiting area gradually grew quieter as the afternoon light shifted across the courthouse windows. What had started as confusion was slowly turning into something heavier, something harder to define. People were no longer whispering because they wanted information. They were whispering because they feared the information they might soon receive. The woman sat alone in the leather chair, her hands resting gently together, her posture unchanged despite the attention surrounding her. Beyond the glass doors, courthouse employees continued gathering in small clusters. Some checked their phones repeatedly. Others stared through the glass and then quickly looked away whenever she noticed them. The air felt different now. The confidence that had carried Ryan Walker through the morning was fading beneath a pressure he could not explain. He stood near the wall pretending to review messages on his phone, but his eyes kept drifting toward the crowd outside. Every few minutes another employee arrived. Every few minutes another concerned expression appeared. None of it made sense. Across the room, the woman slowly turned her gaze toward a large window overlooking downtown Richmond. Winter sunlight reflected off office buildings and parked cars several stories below. The city continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened. People crossed intersections carrying coffee cups. Delivery trucks unloaded packages. Traffic lights changed from red to green and back again. Life continued. For a long moment she simply watched. There was a calmness in that silence that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Then she reached into the pocket of her robe and carefully removed a small photograph. The edges were worn from years of handling. She looked down at it briefly. Not with sadness. Not with regret. With gratitude. The photograph showed an older man standing outside a modest brick house many years earlier. A father. A mentor. A man who had spent his entire life teaching that dignity was not something another person could give or take away. Ryan noticed the photograph from across the room. He could not see the image itself, only the way she looked at it. The expression unsettled him more than anger would have. There was no bitterness in her face. No desire for revenge. Only patience. As though she understood that truth moved on its own schedule. The ticking clock above the doorway marked each passing second. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator opened and closed. A distant telephone rang. The ordinary sounds seemed strangely amplified in the silence. Then a courthouse janitor entered the hallway beyond the glass doors. He stopped when he saw the woman. For a brief moment, his face softened with recognition. He placed one hand over his heart and nodded respectfully before continuing on his way. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. Yet several people noticed it. Ryan noticed it too. The woman returned the nod with a faint smile. Nothing more. No words were exchanged. But something about that simple interaction carried more weight than everything that had happened since the courtroom. Ryan looked away first. For the first time all day, he found himself questioning not what was happening, but who it was happening to. And as shadows lengthened across the floor and courthouse staff continued gathering beyond the glass, an uncomfortable realization began forming in the back of his mind. Whatever story he thought he was writing this morning, he was no longer the one controlling it. The breakthrough came at 2:43 that afternoon. Not with shouting. Not with sirens. Not with some dramatic interruption. It arrived in the form of a single elevator door opening at the far end of the hallway. Several people noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. 3 individuals stepped out and moved with unmistakable purpose toward the waiting area. The first was a senior official from the State Judicial Oversight Division. The second was Richmond's chief court administrator. The third was a gray-haired attorney whose face was familiar to nearly everyone who worked in the building. Ryan Walker recognized them instantly. A knot formed in his stomach before a single word was spoken. The three officials approached the glass doors and entered the waiting area. The atmosphere changed immediately. Even Derek Collins straightened his posture. Something about their expressions made it clear this was no routine visit. The senior oversight official stopped directly in front of Ryan. "Officer Walker," he said calmly, "we need to speak right now." Ryan attempted to maintain control. "This is an active investigation." The official did not react. Instead, he held out a folder nearly 2 inches thick. "No," he replied quietly. "What is active is a very serious misunderstanding." The words seemed to suck all the air from the room. Ryan stared at the folder. His confidence began slipping away one piece at a time. The chief court administrator turned toward the woman seated near the window. His expression softened immediately. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "we apologize for this situation." The room went completely silent. Every person beyond the glass doors froze. Every whisper stopped. Every phone lowered. Ryan blinked. Then blinked again. As though his mind refused to process what he had just heard. "Your Honor." The title echoed through the waiting area. Suddenly dozens of strange moments from the day rushed back into focus. The attorneys. The courthouse staff. The worried expressions. The respectful nod from the janitor. The gathering crowds. The silence. The disbelief. It all made sense now. The woman slowly stood. She offered the administrator a polite nod. Nothing more. No anger. No triumph. No attempt to embarrass anyone. The gray-haired attorney stepped forward and opened the folder. "This," he said carefully, "is Chief Judge Naomi Brooks." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Chief Judge. Not simply a judge. Not simply a respected member of the court. The Chief Judge overseeing multiple judicial districts, and one of the most influential legal authorities in the state. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. Derek looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The attorney continued. "Furthermore, Judge Brooks has spent the last 8 months supervising a confidential review involving procedural misconduct complaints and allegations of corruption connected to several public officials." Ryan stared at him. The attorney met his eyes. "Including matters connected to information your department was instructed not to interfere with." A terrible realization settled over the room. The people gathering outside had not been worried about Judge Brooks. They had been worried about the officers. They understood from the beginning what Ryan had failed to see. Every step he had taken through the courthouse had been witnessed. Every public display of authority had unfolded before attorneys, court employees, reporters, and legal professionals who knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was. The woman looked at Ryan for the first time since leaving the courtroom. There was no hatred in her eyes. No satisfaction. Only disappointment. And somehow that was far worse. Because in that moment Ryan finally understood the truth. The most powerful person he had confronted all day had never once needed to remind anyone who she was. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The waiting area remained frozen beneath the weight of what had just been revealed. The realization spread beyond the glass doors and through the courthouse with astonishing speed. Messages were sent. Calls were made. Reporters updated headlines. Employees who had spent years working inside the building exchanged stunned looks. Ryan Walker stood motionless, staring at Chief Judge Naomi Brooks as if seeing her for the first time. Yet the most remarkable part of the moment was not the revelation itself. It was her response. She did not celebrate. She did not humiliate him. She did not demand an apology. She simply stood there with the same calm dignity she had carried since the beginning of the day. The senior oversight official opened the folder and removed several documents. His expression remained professional, but there was disappointment in his eyes. "Officer Walker," he said quietly, Effective immediately, your involvement in this matter is terminated pending review. The words landed heavily. Derek Collins lowered his head. Ryan opened his mouth as though preparing to defend himself, but no explanation came. The confidence that had carried him through the courthouse was gone. Not because someone had taken it from him. Because the truth had exposed how fragile it had always been. Around them, more officials began arriving. Legal advisors. Administrative supervisors. Members of the Oversight Division. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a spectacle. The authority Ryan had tried so hard to display all day was now being replaced by something much more powerful. Accountability. Through the glass, dozens of employees continued watching. Some had worked under Judge Brooks for years. Others had only heard stories about her fairness, her discipline, and her refusal to treat people differently based on status or position. Yet nearly everyone shared the same reaction. Relief. Relief that the truth had finally surfaced. Relief that dignity had prevailed over arrogance. Ryan looked down at the floor. For the first time, he seemed aware of how many people had witnessed his actions. The crowded courtroom. The long hallway. The rotunda. The waiting area. Every step had been public. Every assumption had been visible. Every decision had unfolded in front of people who understood far more than he did. Judge Brooks noticed the shame spreading across his face. For a moment, the room waited to see what she would do. This was the point where many people would seek revenge. This was the moment when humiliation could easily be returned. Instead, she walked forward. Her footsteps were soft against the polished floor. Ryan slowly lifted his eyes. "Officer Walker," she said. Her voice remained calm. "The law exists to protect people from power used carelessly. That includes everyone. No anger. No bitterness. Just truth." The simplicity of her words seemed to affect the room more than any punishment could have. Ryan lowered his gaze again. He understood now that the person standing before him had never needed authority to command respect. She earned it through character. The oversight official closed the folder and prepared to leave with his team. Around them, courthouse employees gradually returned to their duties. Conversations resumed. Phones were lowered. Yet something had changed. Not only for Ryan. For everyone who had witnessed the day unfold. Because they had seen a rare thing. They had seen dignity remain unshaken in the face of public humiliation. And they had seen power collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. By early evening, the courthouse had returned to something resembling normal. The crowds had dispersed. Reporters had moved on to file their stories. Employees finished their work and headed home through the fading winter light. Outside, Richmond glowed beneath a sky painted in shades of gold and deep blue. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Traffic flowed steadily through downtown intersections. The day that had begun with confusion and humiliation was quietly drawing to a close. Inside courtroom 4A, the silence felt different now. Not tense. Not uncertain. Peaceful. Rows of empty seats stretched beneath the soft glow of overhead lights. Legal documents sat neatly stacked on desks. The flag in the corner stood motionless. Through the tall windows, the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Chief Judge Naomi Brooks stood alone near the bench for a moment before taking her seat. No audience remained to watch. No cameras remained to record. No speeches needed to be given. She simply settled into the chair she had occupied countless times before and looked out across the empty courtroom. The room felt exactly as it always had. And perhaps that was the point. Real justice was never about attention. It was never about headlines. It was about consistency. About showing up every day and doing what was right even when nobody noticed. Her eyes drifted toward the gallery where dozens of strangers had sat earlier that morning. Some had arrived expecting an ordinary hearing. Instead, they had witnessed a lesson that would stay with them long after the details faded. They had seen assumptions exposed. They had seen arrogance collapse. Most importantly, they had seen dignity refuse to surrender. Naomi reached into her robe pocket and removed the worn photograph once more. The image of her father looked back at her from another era. She remembered the lessons he had repeated throughout her childhood. Treat every person with respect. Listen before judging. Never confuse position with character. Those lessons had carried her through law school, through years of public service, and through every challenge that came afterward. Today they had carried her through something else as well. She placed the photograph back into her pocket and allowed herself a small smile. Not because she had won. Not because someone else had lost. Because the principle she believed in had survived another test. Beyond the courtroom doors, a janitor slowly pushed a cleaning cart down the hallway. The wheels rolled softly across the floor. Somewhere in the building, an elevator bell sounded. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. The courthouse continued breathing the way it always had. Naomi rose from her chair and gathered the final papers from the bench. Before leaving, she paused briefly and rested one hand on the polished wood. The room stood silent around her. Then she reached for the gavel. One measured strike echoed through the empty courtroom. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear. Final. Certain. The sound faded into the stillness. Outside, evening settled over the city. Inside, the courtroom remained exactly as it should be. Quiet. Steady. Waiting for tomorrow. And as Naomi Brooks walked toward the exit, her footsteps disappearing into the hallway beyond, the silence left behind seemed to carry a message stronger than any speech ever could. Respect is not granted by a title. Character is not proven by power. And justice, when guided by dignity, never needs to raise its voice to be heard.